Okay, welcome everybody. Today we're going to start talking about responses to Catholic social teaching, and we'll be dealing specifically with the neoconservatives and with Michael Novak. So let's get started. Something I need to point out at the beginning, though, is that there is no single correct approach to Catholic social teaching. There's a variety of contending approaches. The point is, it's not a socio-economic system. Okay, it's not like a libertarianism or neoclassicism or anything like that. Rather, it's a set of judgments. It's a standard for judgment, all the other systems. So there can be a variety of legitimate responses, and no one should ever tell you this is the only correct approach. That simply isn't true. Nevertheless, some responses are certainly better than others. All right. Now, D. Stephen Long has separated the responses to Catholic social tradition into three interpretive traditions. Okay, the first he calls the dominant tradition, the second the emerging tradition, and the third he calls the residual tradition. And they're really split on three issues. What kind of a science is economic science? Is it a physical science or a humane science? And they're split on the issue of marginalism. So does marginalism properly exhaust the subject of economics? And finally, and perhaps most importantly, they're split on the issue of property. So we can kind of put this into a matrix. If we look at marginalism, science, and property, and look at the three traditions, the dominant tradition, well, the dominant tradition accepts marginalism, accepts economic science as it represents itself, and therefore it treats it more or less as a physical science. And it considers property absolute. Now, the emergent tradition does not accept marginalism whatsoever. Their approach to science is rooted in Marxism. And they consider property to be primarily social. And finally, then, there's the residual tradition. It accepts marginalism within bounds. It considers economics to be a humane science, and it has a limited view of property. So, let's look at some examples. In the dominant tradition, we find things like neoconservatism, neoliberalism, Austrian libertarianism, neoclassical economics, for example, are all of these views are more or less comfortable with neoclassical economics. The emergent tradition, generally it's called liberation theology. Now, liberation theology does indeed have a lot to contribute to these questions. However, its real home is in South America, and it's dealing with issues that are very important to South America and very particular to the history of South America. And it is heavily influenced by Marxism, although they have formally repudiated Marx as a teacher. Nevertheless, there's still an awful lot of Marxism involved in the emergent tradition. Now, we are not going to be looking at liberation theology, and that's not, I don't want to prejudice the case there, but the reason is that since the majority of students here are business students, liberation theology just doesn't have that much to say to business students. Now, I think it's worth studying. It just doesn't fit the contours of this class as well as it might. Finally, that leaves the residual tradition. And here we find things like democratic socialism, social democracy, anarcho-libertarianism, cooperativism, and distributism. So these vary in their attitudes basically towards the role of the state. Some give the state more influence in setting policy, and some give it less influence in setting policy, but they all sort of want to end up in the same place. All right. Well, today, as I said, we'll be looking at the neoconservative response, and we'll look at the origins of neoconservatism, and we'll look at Michael Novak and Max Weber. And then we'll look at Novak's very important text, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. We'll look at Novak's theology of capitalism. We'll do an evaluation and critique. And finally, we'll look at neoconservatism since Novak. Okay. All right, the origins of neoconservatism. We'll talk about their origins, their influence and support, their relation to modernism, and then Michael Novak and the spirit of democratic capitalism. Okay, the origins. Largely, this was a group of disillusioned liberals beginning in the 1970s. All the major figures in neoconservatism started out on the left but ended up on the right. They were concerned with what they saw as the failure of the welfare state. And they were very concerned about the degradation of culture. They were especially upset over liberalism's support of Palestine against Israel, since many of them were prominent Jewish intellectuals. And so the joke was that a neoconservative was a liberal mugged by reality. It is important to note that this was very much a religious movement, or at least a movement that was rooted in religious traditions, particularly, but not confined to, Jewish and Catholic intellectuals. So the founders were people like Michael Novak, Norman Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary, William Crystal, Leo Strauss. I put Leo Strauss there. He wouldn't be considered a neoconservative, but they rely a lot on the thought of Leo Strauss. So it's sort of a combination of economic liberalism and social conservatism. Their influence has been tremendous. The journals that they have great influence over or totally control are like National Review, Commentary, First Things, maybe less influence today than they used to have. The American Spectator, although I think that's gone out of business. Now I put Fox News in here. Fox News obviously isn't a journal, but the neoconservatives had a tremendous amount of influence on the Murdoch empire. So that sort of gave them a secure base from which to shall we say, preach. And they have a lot of financial support. So foundations such as the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Acton Institute, the Atlas Foundation, which sort of works in the developing countries, founding Acton Institute, libertarian or conservative type economic and social think tanks. And they have strong financial backers like the Koch brothers, Rupert Murdoch, and strong political support. So high officials in both the Reagan and Bush administrations, they were a little less welcome in the Trump administration. Now, you have to look at the relationship of neoconservatism to modernism. Pre-Vatican II Catholics were very, very countercultural, okay? That is, we refrained from fish on Friday. So if you didn't eat fish on Friday, everybody knew you were a Catholic, and people were very keen on keeping all the feast days, the holy days. Catholics frequently wore scapulars or carried rosary, and so they were sort of an identifiable group. But the Enlightenment values are so ingrained in our culture, and the media, of course, is a thoroughly modern institution. What else would it be? There's always a desire of people to be more integrated with their surrounding culture. And Catholics were feeling that same pressures to be more American. Then came Vatican II. With Vatican II, there was an attempt then to sort of meld the church, bring the church into the modern world was one of the stated goals. So this left this was kind of a shock to the Catholic in the pew. And you had on the right figures like John Smirak writing about illiberal Catholics. He wanted Catholics to embrace the modern world, but embrace it in conservative terms. And he said, and this is interesting, Catholicism minus the Enlightenment equals the Inquisition. So in other words, if Catholics would not adopt themselves to the modern world, then we're going to be, not fit to live with. Okay. So along comes Michael Novak and the spirit of democratic capitalism. Now, he was a prominent liberal theologian who became a conservative. How conservative? Well, depends on how you read the tea leaves there. And his great book that became a founding document for neoconservatism was The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. And it was decisive in moving many, many Catholic conservatives to neoconservatism. Now, to understand Novak's work, you also have to understand an earlier author, Max Weber. Max Weber, 1864 to 1920, and he wrote a lot about capitalism and Calvinism. He wrote about the ideals of capitalism and about the fact-value distinction, which becomes very important for Novak. Okay, Weber is one of the founders, along with Emil Durkheim, of modern sociology. And he was looking at the interplay of culture and religion. And when he looked at the modern world, what he found was rationalism, secularism, and what he called disenchantment. So, now his book was titled The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Okay? Now notice the similarity to, you see how Novak has sort of taken over that title. And he was writing about what he considered to be the fatal combination of Protestantism and capitalism. Well, for Weber, capitalism sort of was identified with the Calvinist ethic. He asked the question, why do Protestants make better capitalists? This is a very interesting thing because the economic center of Europe used to be Southern Europe, used to be Catholic Europe. But after the Reformation, the economic center moved north. It moved into northern Germany. It moved into northern France and to England, to Holland. And Weber found this an interesting phenomenon. Well, he believed that predestination and the inner loneliness of Calvinism was the answer. Because here's the problem. Okay, everybody's predestined to go to heaven or hell. Well, how do you know that you're the one of those predestined for heaven and not one of those predestined for hell? And the problem is that no sacrament, no priest, no work could aid in your salvation. These were all conveniences, but they were not determinative. And total depravity made sin the only constant. So man was totally depraved. And he was chosen by God before all ages either to go to heaven or to go to hell. And there's just no way out of God's eternal decision. Well, Weber said this is a terrible psychological burden. Well, how do you solve this problem? Wealth. Wealth was a sign of your election. If you were wealthy, that means that God favored you. So this developed the summum bonum of this theology is the pursuit of wealth without enjoyment. Now, I'm not going to get into the question of whether Weber has fairly characterized Calvinism. I'm merely pointing out that this is the way he did characterize Calvinism. Well, this had what Weber called an unintended consequence. So Calvinism is very, very successful, but this religious spirit dies out, leaving only the pursuit of wealth as the remaining public ethic. So now he does another thing. He proposes a fact-value distinction. Now, and it's methodological. It's not ontological. He's not asserting that there are two ontological orders, an order of facts and an order of values. What he is saying is that for the purposes of his book, he is not examining the truth or falsity of Calvinism, but only its psychological and cultural effects. Now, Weber identifies a number of ideals of capitalism. The first is the commodification of labor. Labor in the new system must become completely a commodity to be bought or sold at the lowest price. And the pursuit of wealth becomes a religious vocation. But although it's a religious vocation, it's pursued through totally secular means. So this is where you get that divide, between the things that relate to the next world, but in this world, everything is totally secular. Okay? So we pursue our wealth through secular means. And it's a world guided by rationalism. Okay? Everything is rationalized. Everything is reduced to reason. And it's impersonal. Okay. So, you've heard the phrase, nothing personal, it's just business. Well, that would fit in with Weber's idea of Calvinistic capitalism. So as one commentator said of them, specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart. This nullity imagines that it has attained a level of civilization never before achieved. Max Weber. Well, you can tell that Weber did not like the Calvinists, and he did not like capitalism, and he especially did not like the combination. Now, that would seem to be a strange choice for Michael Novak, a defender of both religion and capitalism, to choose. So he does some very interesting things with Weber. So we'll look at his major themes. We'll look at his view of the ideals of capitalism. We'll look at his view of the doctrine of unintended consequences and the three orders of society. So the major themes for Novak. Now we're talking about Novak. We've gone from Weber to Novak. We're looking how Novak is using Weber. Because he's kind of Weber in reverse. He stands Weber on his head. And he accepts the fact-value distinction not as methodological, but as ontological. there really are two distinct orders of reality, an order of facts and an order of values. Hence, that means that there are two levels of natural law, the analytic natural law and the normative natural law. Now, all the things that all the great theologians had been studying up till now, like Thomas Aquinas or Augustine, whatever, when they spoke about natural law, was the normative natural law. Well, for them it was the only natural law. But now Novak wants to write to add another level of natural law, which we would call naturalism, but he would say it's the analytic natural law. And at the heart of society, he's going to place an empty shrine. That is, he is not trying to build a specifically Christian system. He is going to assert that capitalism and democracy are inseparable, and that the church must embrace both. The church must become a supporter of both capitalism and democracy. Because, he says, any attempt to try to run the economy by the highest Christian principles is certain to destroy both the economy and the reputation of Christianity. All right, commodification of labor is the first principle, and this is a condition of labor's freedom. So freed from the soil, freed from feudal ties, and reduced to something that's just bought or sold, no longer as a social relationship, then labor is finally free to get the best price it can. And he agrees with Weber that capitalism is a purely rationalistic system. And it's impersonal. Now, what Novak means by this is that there is a separation of the world of work and the world of home. Now, he looks at sin as foundational, and this reflects not so much Weber as Calvin. This reflects the idea of total depravity. The state must not seek to check sin. It's just a fact, and there's nothing you can do about it. Nevertheless, he believes that capitalism and democracy are the systems of natural liberty. The system of democratic capitalism, believing itself to be the natural system of liberty, is best designed to meet the premises of original sin. Its chief aim is to fragment and check power, but not to repress sin. Now, his next idea is self-interest, which he calls virtuous self-interest. So self-interest properly pursued, he said, is virtuous. He's a little bit unclear about how you distinguish virtuous self-interest from the other kind, but nevertheless, this is one of his foundational principles. And he believes in communitarian individualism. Well, this seems to be a contradiction in terms, and I'm not sure that he ever resolves those terms. Well, he does have an interesting way of resolving. We'll get to it in a minute. And he believes in pluralism, and we'll expand on that in a bit. And he also believes in continuous revolution. Now, he doesn't mean revolution in the Marxist sense. He means that capitalism is always tearing down what it's built. Okay, and he actually gets this from an economist by the name of Schumpeter, who believes that capitalism is always sort of destroying itself to build something new until finally capitalism will destroy capitalism itself. He believes very strongly in the separation of the moral and economic realms. Now, this goes right along, as you can have probably already picked up, with the separation of natural law into the analytic and the normative, is separation of the religious and the secular realms, is separation of the home and the work areas, etc., etc. So he says, claims on the part of groups to represent conscience, morality, and principle must be exposed for what they are, disguises for naked power and raw interest. So he's very suspicious of any moral claims on the economy. The doctrine of unintended consequences. Now, this is another one he takes over from Weber. For Weber, this concentration on, this religious capitalism, the unintended consequence was that the religious part withered away, leaving just capitalism. But Novak uses this in a slightly different way. He says, concentration on good ends will always have bad consequences. So we must turn away from looking at moral intentions to look only at social consequences. So here we see the philosophy known as consequentialism. Therefore, he believes, if we concentrate on purely commercial ends, liberty will be the result. And for the neoconservatives, liberty is the highest moral value. Well, it seems to me that's a sort of an attempt to fool unintended consequences. So if you, it's sort of by misdirection, unintended consequences will get fooled, and you'll always have a good result. I think it's a little bit naive, but okay. Now, he says he believes that there are three orders of society: the political order, the economic order, and the moral cultural order. Now, the political order, he says, is dangerous because it has the power to destroy an industry, and he uses as an example the nuclear power industry. The political order, he says, must not intrude into business. The economic order provides the material base of society. Well, that's certainly true. And he says it develops the virtues. Further, because the political order is so dangerous, we need powerful industries to check the state. So these industries must be as powerful as the state and have the strength to oppose the state. All right, so what about the third order, the moral cultural order? This, he says, is the weakest part of the system. Because the moral cultural system, cultural order does not give sufficient support for capitalism. And this is unfortunate because, he says, businessmen are too busy with business to be able to give an adequate defense of capitalism. So the priests, the preachers, ought to give this defense of capitalism that the businessman is too busy to give himself. All right. Now we come to Novak's theology of capitalism. Okay. He says we need a new type of religion and a new theology. Free persons, he says, require pluralist institutions. Traditional religion must be made compatible with pluralism. Biblical texts, these texts, he says, which were written in an age of camels and caravans, do not contemplate the kinds of problems that we face today. And he says Christian symbols must not be placed at the center of a pluralist society. So, this new theology depends on 6 doctrines that sort of come from Christianity, but not in their Christian form. Remember, these are secular doctrines. So they're derived from Christianity, or Novak believes they are, but they remain secular. So he starts with original sin, the Trinity, the Incarnation, competition, separation of church and state, and caritas. All right, now, what does it mean that these are not in their Christian form? If you take a doctrine like, for instance, the Incarnation or the Trinity, how can they have a non-Christian form? Okay, let's look at that, because it becomes very, very interesting, I think. So, original sin. Sin, he says, cannot be checked by the political or economic system. Reform can only come from the moral, cultural system. So this is pure individualism. So there really isn't a social aspect of sin. Sin is all individual. So there's no social system to be reformed, at least not moral reform. Okay, any reform would be, fine-tuning the carburetor or adjusting the gears, but it's not really any kind of moral reform. The term just does not apply to systems. Term morals only applies to individuals. So within democratic capitalism, he says, every vice must be allowed to flourish. This must not be restricted. He says a free society can tolerate the public display of vice because it has confidence in the basic decency of human beings. All right, the Trinity. Well, you'd think this is very Christian doctrine. So what's the secular form of the Trinity? Well, he says the Trinity is a symbol, since nobody has seen God. But what the Trinity does teach us, he says, is pluralism, because there's three, right? So, this he carries into capitalism, his theology of capitalism. Under capitalism, communities are not just of kith and kin, but are voluntary and fluid. So, he accomplishes, what he's aiming at is the elevation of contractual communities over natural ones. So, you have a last name, you're a member of a family, you're an American, you're a Texan, whatever. You were born into these communities. These are natural communities. But you're interning for IBM. That's contractual. That's an act of your free will. And therefore, it is of more import than these natural communities. The one God of Christians is also plural. Appropriately, then, the mind becomes accustomed to seeing pluralism in unity through creation, even in social systems. All right, the Incarnation. I have difficulty characterizing this, so I'll just quote him. The point of the Incarnation is to respect the world as it is, to acknowledge its limits, and to disbelieve any promises that the world now or ever will be transformed into the city of God. If Jesus could not effect that, how shall we? The world is not going to become, ever, a kingdom of justice and love. A political economy based on love and justice is to be found beyond, never to be fully incarnated within, human history. All right, competition. Again, I'll just quote Novak on this point. A political economy needs bold political leaders who thrive in contests of power. The will to power must be made creative, not destroyed. Well, those of you who are familiar with Nietzsche will recognize this. St. Paul bids all to compete, to measure themselves as he measures himself. Religious compassion does not involve leveling. The Christian is inspired to noble competition by the examples of the saints who have gone before. The competition is relentless. Judgment is constant. Critics sometimes suggest that competitiveness is foreign to a religion of love, meekness, and peace. They have no idea how hard it is to be meeker than one's neighbor. For all these reasons, it seems wrong to imagine that the spirit of competition is foreign to the Gospels, and that competition for money is humankind's most mortal spiritual danger. Okay, separation of church and state. Because of pluralism, the economy cannot be Christian. This means that the political economy of a democratic capitalism cannot, in principle, be a Christian system. It cannot even be suffused with Christian values and purposes. On the question of abortion, for example, all might be well advised not to demand in law all that their own conscience commands. And then he will go on to say that another reason for separation of church and state is that business needs protection from religion. So not only is the state a threat to business, but the church can be a threat to business as well. No intelligent human order can be run according to the counsels of Christianity. Caritas. Caritas, he says, teaches us realism. And he says it is the basis of contractual community. So when you contract to work for IBM or Microsoft or whatever it might be, this is a contractual community and an expression of caritas. Individuals are not to be understood as fragments of a collective, members of a kinship group or ethnic conclave, but as individual others. Well, therefore, contractual communities are higher than natural ones. Yet, when they form communities, they choose them, elect them, contract for them. The natural state of political community for persons is arrived at not by primordial belonging, but by constitutional compact. The economic demands of caritas are fulfilled by production. A system of political economy imitates the demand of caritas by reaching out, creating, inventing, producing, and distributing, raising the material base of the common good. All right, evaluation and critique. All right, we're going to start with the critical question. We're going to take a look at the new theology and his naturalism, and finally the question of liberty. Now, for any work that you're reading, the critical question is always this: does the author accomplish what he set out to do? Well, what is Novak trying to do? He's trying to reconcile capitalism and Christianity. And what means does he use? Does he actually succeed in reconciling them? So that's the question that confronts us. Does he reconcile them, or does he just subordinate one to the other? Well, as new theology, we can ask of these new theologies, these new doctrines, are these six doctrines compatible with Christian understanding of these doctrines? Now, clearly the answer is no, but that wouldn't bother Novak. But one, competition, and possibly a second one, the separation of church and state, are entirely novel. You won't find them in any theological text. So, have these doctrines been drained of a specifically Christian content? If so, can that be called a reconciliation? I mean, if you've drained them of their Christian content, then you haven't really reconciled them with capitalism. Naturalism. Democratic capitalism is assumed to be the natural system of liberty. This is a phrase he uses throughout the text. And since it is natural, it is beyond question. I mean, you can't question natural things. You can't question that water is H2O. You can't question the inverse square law, etc., etc. These things just are. Well, capitalism belongs to these things that just are. It can't be questioned. However, this is an assumption of his text. In no place in this text does he offer any evidence for this assumption. So you either have to accept it or reject it. But it will not be argued. Well, if capitalism is natural, well, you cannot change it. Hence, if capitalism can't change, religion has to change. You need a new theology and a new kind of religion. That makes perfect sense if you accept his premise going in. But if you don't, well, there you are. But by having a new theology, does he not concede that the traditional theology simply does not agree with capitalism? All right, the question of liberty. Liberty functions as the ultimate moral value throughout the text. In the name of liberty, the cultural moral order must be modified to serve capitalism. But there is no discussion of the meaning of liberty. It functions almost like a magic talisman. So you invoke it, to sort of end any argument, end any discussion. All right, neoconservatism since Novak. The challenge, the answers: deny the church's authority, the argument from prudence, and reinterpret the church's teaching. Because here's the challenge. Reconcile Catholic social teaching with Enlightenment liberalism, especially economic liberalism, or what we now call capitalism. Now, few are willing to take the theological liberties that Novak did. And since Novak's book, remember this is 1982, further encyclicals have only widened that gap. All right, first strategy, deny the church's authority. Treat economics as a matter of pure science. Well, that's Novak's naturalistic strategy. Therefore, it is beyond the church's competence. Then you have to individualize morality. Morality is simply an individual matter with no social or cultural dimensions. And economics is part of the analytic natural law. Therefore, it cannot be criticized under the moral law. Now, you'll see people who argue this way are Thomas Woods, a very prominent Catholic neoconservative, Alejandro Chafuen. Alejandro is head of the Atlas Foundation, which sets up neoconservative think tanks in third world countries. By the way, I've extensively interacted with these gentlemen. The next argument is the argument from prudence. Social justice is a matter of prudence. Well, that's certainly true. I mean, the church is only offering standards of judgment, and it is up to the laity to find a way to get there. But since prudential teachings are not binding, the church really doesn't have authority here. Well, we kind of dealt with this before. It confuses means and ends. Prudence deals with means, not ends. Justice, as for example, the just wage, is an end. Okay. It's not subject to prudence. As an end, it's not subject to prudence. How you get there is subject to prudence. The means are prudential, not the ends. Okay. The argument from prudence, very popular at the Acton Institute and with John Smeerack, for example. And then there's an effort to reinterpret the text. So reinterpret the text to be as close to libertarian or neoclassical theory as possible. This especially became prominent during the Centesimus Annus controversy. When Centesimus Annus came out, some tried to argue that it was the church had reversed its position and was now supporting capitalism. This was based solely on paragraph 42, on half a sentence in paragraph 42. Nevertheless, it was a long and serious argument. The more recent encyclicals have made this even more difficult. So George Weigel, very prominent neoconservative, especially when Benedict issued Caritas in Veritate, that was used very, very disturbed. He offered a theory in The Gold and the Red, an article entitled The Gold and the Red. He said the Caritas in Veritate was not really written by Pope Benedict, that it was written by social justice radicals whom he was trying to appease. And so he just signed it. Said only certain parts were written by Benedict, and these he called the parts in gold. You see, but the rest of the encyclical was in red, and we know what red means, don't we? Well, the reinterpretation is often mixed with prudential or libertarian strategies. Few took the bold step of Novak's new theology. But, I have to ask, is Novak actually being more intellectually honest than his compatriots? I mean, is it, can you really reconcile these two things, or do you, under the existing theology, the theologies of the last 2,000 years, or do you really have to have, as Novak said, a new theology? And I think he might be right. Okay, well, that then is Novak's view of neoconservatism. All right, so what questions can we pose to this text? All right, let me suggest oops, sorry. What am I doing? I'll get this, don't worry. Or maybe I won't. All right. Does Novak successfully reconcile Catholic social teaching and conservatism? Another question we can ask, this is turning out to be a mess. All right, there we go. Do it this way. Edit here on the fly. There we are. If you remove the Christian elements, is it still a theology? I mean, if you take sort of the supernatural aspects out of the incarnation and the resurrection, well, you can call them a philosophy, you can call them an ideology, you can call them a lot of things. I'm not sure you could still call them a theology, all right? And so finally, does this really just end up as an ideology? Okay. Those are two questions we could start off with, but bring your own questions and comments to the discussions. Read over his text if you haven't read over his text. It's very, very interesting. Obviously, I'm not a big fan of it, but when you read it, you may have a different opinion. So feel free to bring those opinions to the discussion boards and into our study group discussions. All right. I thank you all very much, and I'll look forward to meeting you all in the study groups and on the discussion board.